Chapter 1. Under the blood moon. The wind bit at her skin, a cold reminder of the world she had come to know too well, harsh, unforgiving, and thick with a silence that echoed in her bones. The blackthorn forest stretched around her like a dying dream, every tree a weary skeleton reaching toward a sky that couldn't care less. The leaves were gone, replaced by bare branches that scraped at the heavens, as if begging for something, anything, to halt the inevitable decay. Seline Blackthorn stood amidst it all, her fingers grazing the rough bark of a nearby oak. The wood was brittle, dry, as though it had forgotten what it meant to live. Magic lingered in the air, thick and pulsing, but it was old. Tired magic, suffocated by years of use and misuse. She'd spent years trying to nurture it, trying to fight the curse that had taken root in her soul and poisoned the earth around her. But tonight the forest felt heavier, like the blood moon had made everything worse. A spellbook lay open at her feet, its pages yellowing with age, the ink faded in places where time had claimed it. She whispered the incantation under her breath, the words slipping out like familiar strangers. A soft glow swirled around her hands as she held them above the gnarled roots of the oak, focusing on the magic, hoping for something, anything, to break the curse that had claimed her family for generations. The air hummed with dark energy, but the spell sputtered like a dying ember. The faint light flickered, then died, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of failure in her mouth. A crack echoed through the trees as the spell backfired, scattering the last remnants of hope she had. She cursed under her breath and clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. "Come on, damn you," she muttered to the empty forest, to the curse that wrapped its claws around her soul. But no matter how hard she tried, the rot wouldn't lift. The magic had turned against her, once again. She took a step back, feeling the weight of the centuries-old curse press down on her chest. The trees around her seemed to lean in, as if to remind her of how little time she had left to undo the damage her ancestors had done. There was no escaping this place, not until the curse was broken. Or until it broke her. A sigh escaped her lips, and for a moment Seline let herself feel the weariness settle into her bones. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't from fear. No, it was from the frustration of being trapped in a web she couldn't escape. Her magic was weak, the forest was dying, and the blood moon hung overhead, its glow a cruel reminder of her fate. But then a rustle from the darkness. Heavy, unnatural. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in the stillness of the forest. The ground beneath her feet seemed to hum, as if it recognized something she couldn't yet see. She spun around, her instincts on high alert. She felt it before she saw it, the eyes, hot, burning, hungry. A predator's gaze. Her pulse quickened. Someone was coming. But was it friend or foe? Her heart whispered the answer, but she ignored it. Tonight, the moon was too bright, and the forest too alive with secrets. She wasn't ready to face whatever this was, but she knew she had no choice. She never had a choice. The first howl cut through the air, and just like that, everything changed. The cottage smelled like earth and old paper, the kind of musty scent that comes from too many forgotten tomorrows. The shelves were crammed with jars and bottles, their contents a collection of strange, forgotten things. Dried herbs, books of spells with their spines cracked, and bottles of oil, some labelled, some not. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the clutter. Outside, the wind howled like a thing in torment, but inside it was still, too still. Ivy pushed the door open without knocking, stepping in with the sort of familiarity that only comes from a friendship that's weathered its own storms. The woman was carrying a basket, her hands stuffed with bundles of herbs and the sweet tang of wine. She didn't speak a word as she crossed the small room, and she didn't need to. She knew Seline's face, knew the look of it, that guarded expression that always seemed to be waiting for the world to betray her. "You're still doing this, aren't you?" Ivy said, setting the basket down on the table. Her voice was soft but sharp, like a knife wrapped in velvet. She shot a quick glance to the fire, where its warmth was the only thing pushing back against the biting chill outside. Seline didn't answer. She just stared into the flames, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her cup. "Bad things happen when the sky bleeds." Ivy's voice was low, measured. Seline's jaw tightened, but she didn't look up. She took a long sip from her cup, the wine bitter on her tongue. She had no use for prophecy or superstition. Not now, not after everything she had seen, everything she had endured. The forest was dying, and no amount of warnings could change that. "Iris, stop," Selim muttered. "I've heard it all before. The blood moon. It's just another night." Ivy didn't argue. She leaned back, her eyes never leaving Seline. Ivy knew her well enough to know when not to push, but the weight of the moment still hung in the air, thick with something that neither woman could name. The fire crackled between them, but neither one of them spoke for a long time. Finally Ivy sighed and grabbed the wine bottle, pouring herself a generous glass. "If you won't listen to me, maybe you'll listen to your own damn heart. It's never steered you wrong before." Seline didn't answer. She couldn't. Ivy was right. But that didn't make it any easier to hear. The night stretched on, far too long, far too quiet. Seline lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows twist and writhe. The blood moon hung low in the sky, its pale light spilling through the cracks in the shutters, casting everything in an eerie glow. The wind outside had died down, but there was no peace to be found. Then, as sleep finally claimed her, it came. A pull, like gravity itself, tugging her into the dream. She was running, though where she couldn't say. The world around her was a blur, the air thick with something dark, something predatory, and then she saw them. Eyes, glowing gold, burning with a hunger that could never be satisfied. The shapes were men, but not men, wolves in human form. They moved with a grace that was too fluid to be natural, too dangerous. Lucien, Ronan, Dorian, Kael. Each face was burned into her mind, their gazes locked onto hers as they circled like wolves around prey. The air hummed with their presence, and Seline felt the pulse of something deep within her, something raw, something untamed. "Seline!" a voice rasped from the shadows. It was deep, a growl wrapped in silk. "Come to me!" She didn't know which one it was, but it didn't matter. Her pulse quickened, her body responding before her mind could catch up. She tried to move, to run, but her feet were stuck in the ground, rooted by some invisible force. And then the bite. Teeth sank into her neck, hot and sharp. Her skin burned where the fangs pierced, a sharp electric pain shooting through her veins, making her gasp for breath. The world swirled, blurred, and just before everything went dark, she heard the words that made her heart stop. "You are ours." The dream shattered like glass, and Seline shot up in bed, gasping for air. Her skin was slick with sweat, her heart pounding in her chest like it wanted to burst through her ribs. "Something's coming." She clutched her throat, the sting of phantom teeth still lingering beneath her skin. But there was no one there, no pack, no wolves. Only the silence of the cottage, the hum of the night that felt more alive than ever before. She swallowed hard, the words heavy on her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to speak them. Not yet. There were things she had to face, things she couldn't escape, but she had no idea how much closer they were now. Ravenwood wasn't much of a town, but it had a way of feeling heavy, like a coat you couldn't take off. The cobblestone streets were slick with yesterday's rain, and the houses huddled together in clusters like survivors in a war zone, their windows tight and the doors tighter. The kind of place where every step echoed and every whisper travelled faster than you could hear it. Seline Blackthorn wasn't a stranger here. She'd spent enough time in Ravenwood to know the way the air felt: cold, stiff with suspicion, and too thick with whispers to ever get comfortable. She'd learned to walk with her head down, her coat collar turned high to hide the lines that marked her skin. Lines they couldn't see but knew were there. She wasn't one of them, not by a long shot. She kept to the shadows, the low hum of the town pressing in around her, tightening like a rope. The townspeople didn't look at her. They didn't dare. Men with hard faces kept their gazes fixed to the ground, their boots scuffing over the wet stones. Women with children tugged them close, their eyes flicking to her before darting away, as if even a glance could catch something from her. She wasn't a fool. She knew what they thought. She had been branded before she ever stepped foot in this place. But it still stung, the way they all turned away like a flock of birds when she walked by. It was the kind of sting that wasn't sharp enough to bleed, but enough to leave a scar that wouldn't ever fade. Her boots clicked on the stones as she made her way toward the market square, where the old man with the crooked back ran the general store. She'd been coming here for years. He was the only one who didn't pretend she didn't exist, though he didn't greet her with any kind of warmth either. Just the bare minimum of courtesy, and a price that could make a beggar wince. She pushed the door open, the bell above it jangling with a protest. The smell hit her first, the stale scent of wood, the bitter tang of flour, and the faint metallic bite of something old and forgotten. The shopkeeper, bent and hunched over a counter, didn't look up. She stepped inside, feeling the weight of the eyes that tracked her from the shelves, her every movement calculated, every footstep a statement in a place that didn't want her. The man behind the counter finally looked up, his pale eyes squinting as though he could barely focus on her face. "What do you need?" His voice was dry, worn thin by years of little conversation. She didn't bother with pleasantries. They both knew how this went. "Herbs," she said, keeping her tone flat. "A few roots, some garlic." The man grunted, turning toward the back of the shop, his hunched form shuffling behind the shelves. His body creaked with the sound of old wood being bent under too much weight. The silence stretched like a thin thread, tense enough to snap. It wasn't a secret why the townsfolk feared her, why they treated her like a shadow that had overstayed its welcome. It wasn't just the magic. It was the blood that ran through her veins. The same blood that ran through her mother's, and her mother's mother. Blackthorn blood. He returned with the supplies, dumping them onto the counter without a word. She reached for her coin pouch, but his hand shot out, stopping her before she could move. "I'll be double," he said, his voice almost too quiet. "No one wants to sell to you these days, miss." She didn't flinch, though she could feel the pressure building in her chest. She didn't like the way his words landed, heavy and too real. But it wasn't like she could argue. Everyone had their price. In this town, hers had been marked in a way that couldn't be erased. She dropped the coin onto the counter, watching as he picked it up with his fingers, examining it like it was worth less than what he had given her. "I'll take my things," she said, her voice hard, the thin edge of her anger just below the surface. The shopkeeper slid the goods toward her, his gaze lingering for just a moment too long, like there was something else he wanted to say but couldn't. Or wouldn't. She grabbed the package of herbs, slipping them into her bag with a swift motion before turning on her heel and heading for the door. Behind her the bell rang again. She didn't look back. Outside the sky was still that murky shade of twilight, the shadows in the streets stretching longer with the setting sun. She could feel the weight of it, the pressure building in her chest, but she wasn't sure if it was the curse or just the damn town that made it so hard to breathe. A shout rang out from the street, followed by the hurried scurry of footsteps. Seline didn't turn to see who it was. She didn't need to. The voices in the background, the ones that made sure their words didn't reach her but always reached her, were familiar enough. "You shouldn't have let her in there," a woman whispered harshly to another. The Blackthorn girl. The cursed one. She might be the last witch alive, came the reply, barely above a mutter. She's dangerous. Selene's eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around the bag of herbs in her hand. They were all waiting for her to fail. She could feel it, in the air, like 1,000 invisible strings tugging her towards something she didn't want to face. The blood moon loomed closer each day, its light bleeding into everything, and the forest that surrounded this place, her only home, was starting to die. And if the town's gossip was right, that wouldn't be the worst of it. She didn't need the town's approval, she didn't need their acceptance, but it didn't mean it didn't hurt to be the outcast. Not just the witch, not just the one with the cursed blood, but the one who had always been alone, even when she didn't want to be. It was that damn moon, that damn prophecy. It was all tied together, and she knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before it tore her apart. The door to the tavern swung open with a groan that echoed in the smoky air, the kind of sound that announced trouble, or at least a shift in the night's balance. The room fell quiet, the murmurs of conversation dying down as 4 men stepped inside. They were strangers. No one in Ravenwood had seen them before, and no one was looking to make them feel welcome, but it wasn't the usual cold reception. This time the eyes of every soul in the room locked onto them with the weight of something old, something heavy. These weren't men to ignore. These were wolves in the guise of men. Lucian was the first to cross the threshold, his presence like a storm rolling in off the sea. Tall, broad, with the kind of dark elegance that seemed too intentional, too practiced. His eyes were a deep, stormy grey, and they flicked over the room like he was scanning for threats. He didn't look scared, not in the slightest. Behind him, Ronan strode in like a man who owned the world, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips, as though the whole town was just a bit too tight for his liking. His eyes were a flash of mischief, hazel with flecks of gold, and his gait, loose and confident, spoke of someone who didn't answer to anyone. He caught the eyes of a few of the tavern's women and flashed them a grin that would have made a saint consider sin. Dorian followed, his face sharp and cold, like it had been carved from stone, his black coat trailing behind him like a shadow. His icy blue eyes skimmed the room, calculating, assessing. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. The silence hung around him like a shroud. You could feel it, the tension. He was the one who didn't need to speak. His presence did all the talking for him. And then there was Cale, bringing up the rear, quiet like a storm on the horizon. His dark eyes were deep pools of warmth, the kind you could fall into and never want to come out of. He moved with a certain grace, his broad shoulders shifting beneath his clothes like the weight of the world didn't bother him. He wasn't here for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. Every eye in the room shifted, tracked their movements as they made their way to the bar. It wasn't just the strangers' looks that held the tavern's patrons in place. It was the way they moved. Smooth, coordinated, like they were a single unit, each step perfectly timed to the next. Selene's breath caught in her chest when her eyes locked onto Lucian's. There it was, that strange, inexplicable pull, the kind that made her skin tingle and her heart race. It was like something snapped into place, something that had always been there, buried deep under layers of magic and curses. Her breath faltered, her pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but she felt it. Felt him. Lucian's gaze didn't waver. His lips barely moved as his eyes swept over her, sharp and intense. But there was something there, something she couldn't quite name. Something old. An unspoken recognition passed between them. A silent understanding, as if the world had stopped for just a second to let them meet, to let the threads of fate tighten. She couldn't look away. The others seemed oblivious to the effect they were having, Ronan leaned against the bar, chatting up the bartender with a grin. Dorian ordered a drink, his voice low and measured. Cale glanced around the room, his eyes landing briefly on Seline before flicking away like he had already seen everything he needed to. But Lucian didn't break the stare. His eyes held hers, steady and unwavering, like he was waiting for something to happen, like he knew something she didn't. Seline felt the weight of it. Something was shifting in the air, something she couldn't escape. The moment lingered, stretching like a rubber band pulled too tight, but eventually Lucian broke it, his gaze sliding away as he turned back to his companions. The tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. Selene's heart hammered in her chest, and for a long moment she couldn't think. Her mind raced, her thoughts scattered. She felt exposed, as though he had seen too much too soon. The night dragged on in a blur of clinking glasses and hushed conversations. But all Seline could hear was the pounding of her own heart. The blood moon hung low outside, casting a sickly glow through the windows, painting everything in shades of red and orange. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Ivy slid into the chair opposite her eyes sharp, her brow furrowed. She hadn't missed the way Seline's gaze had lingered on the newcomers. She didn't have to ask. Ivy had been watching the whole thing from across the room, and she knew. She always knew. "They're trouble, Seline." Ivy's voice was a low whisper, barely audible above the murmur of the tavern. "All of them." Seline didn't reply right away. Instead, she looked down at her drink, swirling it in her hand. She didn't need to be told. She already knew it. But there was something else. Something in the air that wasn't just trouble. It was something more, something darker. "I can feel it." Ivy pressed, her eyes narrowing. "Stay away from them. You don't need to get involved with any of them. Trust me." But Seline didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure she could. The bonds stirred within her again, uninvited, relentless. She could feel it. A pull so strong it was like a chain that had been forged in her very blood, pulling her toward Lucian, pulling her toward them all. She couldn't fight it. She couldn't ignore it. Not when it was alive. Not when it was calling to her. Ivy leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "You've always known better than to get tangled up in this mess. Don't let that Paul make you forget everything else." But the words, though they came from a place of concern, didn't reach her. Seline knew Ivy was right. She knew. But still the pull wouldn't relent. There was something about Lucian, something about all of them, that seemed to slice through the walls she'd built around herself, a reminder that nothing in her life had ever been her choice. "I can't help it," Seline whispered, almost to herself, her voice tight with a tension she couldn't release. "Something's different. With them. With him." Ivy exhaled sharply, her eyes flicking to the group at the bar. The wolves. They were a quiet storm, a presence that gnawed at the edges of Seline's senses. Ivy could see it too. She didn't need to say more. "You've always been cursed with that damn blood," Ivy muttered. "But it doesn't have to control you. Not this time." Seline's fingers tightened around her glass, the cold bite of the rim digging into her skin. It wasn't just the blood, it was the moon, it was fate, it was the damn bond. But even as the words echoed in her head, the part of her that had always been afraid to give in, to let the darkness in, was already starting to waver. There was no running from it now, and she knew deep down that tonight was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Bite of Fate. The blood moon hung low in the sky, an unnatural weight pressing down on the night. The streets of Ravenwood were empty, save for the occasional creak of an old building or the distant flutter of a bat's wings. The air was thick, heavy with magic, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Seline kept her pace slow, trying to shake the sense of unease that clung to her like a second skin. She'd left the tavern earlier than usual, escaping the suffocating stares, the tension thick in the air, but the moment her feet hit the winding road home, The quiet began to press in on her. The weight of the night, the pull of the moon, and the nagging sensation that something was wrong. Her fingers brushed the pendant at her neck, the ancient runes glowing faintly in the darkness. The magic within her stirred, restless, but it wasn't enough. Not tonight. It wasn't enough for the danger she felt creeping up behind her. A rustle in the trees, a low growl. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath hitching as the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She wasn't alone anymore, and whatever was out there, it wasn't human. Her eyes scanned the shadows, but it was too late. The wolf came out of nowhere, its monstrous form charging from the darkness with a roar that shattered the quiet of the night. The beast was massive, black fur rippling with muscle, eyes gleaming with hunger. It leapt toward her, jaws snapping, claws swiping through the air. Seline barely had time to react. Her hand shot up, casting a defensive spell, but it was weak, too weak. The magic sputtered out like a dying candle, failing to form a barrier. Panic rose in her chest. She knew what would come next. The wolf was faster, its claws swiping across her arm. She staggered back, the cold bite of the claws slicing through her coat and skin. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the terror creeping up her spine. She wasn't strong enough to fight this. Not alone? Her heart raced. She needed help. She needed... The wolf lunged again, its claws reaching for her throat. Her breath caught in her chest as it closed the distance, the beast's snarls filling her ears, drowning out everything else. She was cornered now, pinned against a tree, its breath hot on her skin. Seline's pulse thundered in her ears, but she didn't have the strength to move. Her hand trembled as she reached for her pendant again, but it was too late. She was out of time. And then, like a force of nature, the world seemed to shift. The ground rumbled beneath her feet, and before the beast could strike, it was tossed aside with a savage force. Seline stumbled forward, gasping for air, her legs weak beneath her. She turned to see the source of the interruption. Lucian. His wolf form was like a living nightmare, sleek black fur rippling as his massive frame moved with the speed and power of a predator. His golden eyes locked onto her for a split second, just enough for her to see the recognition there, the same recognition she had felt earlier. Without a word, he turned back to the beast, and the fight began. Ronan was next. He leapt from the shadows with a laugh that was pure chaos, his form shifting mid-air as he landed on the beast's back. The sound of claws raking through the air, flesh meeting fur, was a brutal symphony as Ronan's laughter echoed in the night. He was all speed and wildness, the embodiment of a reckless predator. Kyle was the last to join the fray. His movements were quieter, more calculated, like a shadow stalking the beast from behind. In a single fluid motion he slammed into the wolf's side, sending it careening into the dirt. His eyes, dark and unblinking, scanned the surroundings as though he were assessing every potential threat, every danger that lingered in the shadows. And then there was Dorian, cold, calculating, and utterly calm. He didn't rush into the fray. Instead, he positioned himself between Seline and the chaos, his icy blue eyes scanning the clearing for any sign of a secondary threat. His posture was relaxed, as if the fight were already over, but his hand was never far from his weapon. The air around him was almost electric, as though the very ground knew to give him space. The wolf's growls echoed through the clearing, but he was no match for the four of them. They tore into the beast with brutal efficiency, every swipe and strike landing with a precision that spoke of years. No, centuries of practice. The fight was over in moments. The beast lay dead at their feet, its blood staining the earth. Seline stood there, breathless, her body shaking as the adrenaline rushed through her veins. She didn't know what to feel, fear, awe, or relief. The wolves had saved her, but what had they saved her from? Lucian was the first to turn toward her, his wolf eyes locking onto hers. The intensity of his gaze was undeniable, like a fire that refused to be ignored. There was something in his eyes, something that spoke of a connection deeper than any words could describe. The same connection she had felt earlier, the pull, the bond that now seemed too powerful to resist. He didn't speak, but she could feel his presence in every fibre of her being. Ronan, with a grin that was all teeth and mischief, walked up next, his eyes flicking over her with a dangerous glint. "Didn't think you'd be the one to need saving, witch," he said, his voice a low rumble. Kyle's gaze was softer, almost sympathetic. He didn't say a word, but his presence was like a balm, steady and grounding. He stood off to the side, ever watchful, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of another threat. Dorian, however, didn't even look at her. His eyes were still locked on the surroundings, cold and calculating, as if nothing had changed, as if this was just another night, another part of the game. The tension in the air thickened. Seline could feel it, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. What could she say? "Thank you" didn't seem nearly enough. Lucian stepped closer, his wolf form now fading into the man he was, tall and imposing. His gaze never left her, and she could feel the weight of his attention, pressing down like the night itself. He stopped just inches from her, close enough that she could smell the musk of his scent, the wildness that clung to him. "You're safe," he said, his voice rough, almost like a growl, but the words carried a weight that felt heavier than the moon itself. Seline didn't know what to say to that either. She didn't need saving, she never had, but somehow here they were, together. Fate had brought them together, and, whether she liked it or not, it was too late to turn back now. Her heart hammered in her chest, the bond stirring again, deeper, stronger than before. There was no escaping it, not anymore. The world was spinning, she could feel it, the edges of her consciousness fraying like old fabric. The moon, that crimson bastard, was still hanging there, its glow turning the clearing into a nightmare. The forest was a blur of movement and blood. Claws clashed against claws, the growls, the snarls, the snapping teeth. They were all around her, too close, too real. The wolf that had attacked her was dead, but the scent of blood still hung thick in the air. Another shape, another beast was closing in, and it wasn't the one that had tried to kill her. No. This one was something else, something dark. Seline's breath hitched as she turned, desperate to make sense of what was happening, but there was no time. A blur of black and gold shot across her line of sight, and then Lucian was there. His form, still partly in wolf shape, crashed into the next beast, tearing into it with the savage grace of an apex predator. But even as he fought, even as he tore into the monster with his claws, she could see the strain on him, the tension in his movements. The fight wasn't over, not yet, and she wasn't safe. Not yet. She tried to move, tried to summon some shred of power from the magic that still hummed in her veins, but the effort was like trying to draw water from a well that had long since run dry. Her spells had failed her, the forest had failed her. She was a shadow in a world that didn't care, caught between forces she couldn't understand. The next thing she knew, the ground shifted beneath her and she was falling. No, thrown. The beast that had come for her had gotten too close, and Lucian wasn't there in time. The claws were sinking into her side, tearing through the leather and flesh with the sound of ripping cloth. Her scream was swallowed by the wind, the pain sharp, too sharp, as if the beast's claws were dragging through her soul. Then, as the wolf's fangs snapped toward her throat, Lucian was there again. His huge form slammed into the beast with a force that shook the earth beneath them. The two animals grappled in a flurry of teeth and fury. Seline's head spun. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She couldn't see, she couldn't think. She could only feel the fire that spread through her veins. Lucien's eyes met hers for the briefest of moments. They were the color of storm clouds before the rain hit. A warning, a promise, And then, without a second thought, he did it. He sank his teeth into her neck. It was no gentle bite, no lover's kiss. It was violent, raw, an ancient thing that sent shockwaves through her. The moment his fangs pierced her skin, a searing pain ripped through her body, blinding her. The fire burned from the inside out, twisting, bending, reshaping her in ways she couldn't comprehend. Her body arched involuntarily, her lungs screaming for air that she couldn't catch. The world tilted, turning black around the edges as the darkness began to claim her. She could feel her magic, her power, rising, surging, but it wasn't hers. It wasn't something she had control over. It was the curse. It was the bond. The ancient bloodline that had cursed her from the moment she had been born was finally activated, and it was tearing through her like a storm breaking through a dam. Her head swam, her chest felt tight, as if she were drowning in the very air around her. Lucien's fangs sank deeper, and she gasped, her body locked in place, unable to move. The world around her began to blur, her vision hazy, until all that remained was the hot, blood-red light of the moon above them. She couldn't fight it, not anymore. The world tilted again, and Seline's mind snapped, the pain pulling her under, drowning her in a sea of fire. The bond, the curse, was alive now, thrumming through her veins like it had always been meant to. She was tethered to him now, forever. And it hurt. It hurt in ways she couldn't describe and ways she couldn't fight. It was the kind of pain that made you forget how to breathe, how to think, how to exist. But it was also something else, something deeper. The bite, the curse, the blood. It was a connection, one that ran through her like a river, cutting through the dam she had built, tearing her walls down, until she had no choice but to feel it. Lucien's eyes never left hers as he pulled back, his breath ragged. The blood, her blood, was still fresh on his lips, staining his face. And as the world slowly started to come back into focus, as the fog began to clear, Seline felt it. She felt him. It wasn't just the magic. It wasn't just the curse. It was something older, something inevitable. She was bound to him now, bound in a way she couldn't escape. The pain lingered, but so did the pull, the bond. It wasn't just a bite. It was a beginning, and she had no idea how to stop it. The first thing Seline noticed when she woke was the smell. It was thick, like pine resin and earth, heavy in the air as if the cabin itself had absorbed the scent of the forest around it. The second thing was the quiet, too quiet. No sounds of the wind, no rustling leaves, not even the call of a distant owl. The silence seemed wrong, oppressive. She blinked hard, her head pounding, the remnants of pain still dragging her under. Her skin was warm, flushed, like she'd been set on fire, and every inch of her body ached, like she'd been trampled by something massive. Then the memories hit her like a fist. The wolf, the blood, Lucien's fangs sinking into her neck, the burning, the darkness, the pull of something ancient, something primal, something that now coursed through her veins. Her breath caught in her throat, and she shot upright, panic flooding her system. Her pulse hammered in her ears, the rapid-fire rhythm of fear. She was lying in a large bed, the sheets soft and thick, their rich fabric foreign against her skin. The walls around her were wood, dark and polished, the low light of a fire flickering in the hearth. The room was too warm, too luxurious. It looked nothing like the cabin she'd left behind. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but she froze when she saw them, 4 men standing in the shadows near the far side of the room. Silent, watching. They hadn't moved since she'd opened her eyes. They had to have known she was awake. Seline's heart slammed against her ribs, the pulse of adrenaline surging through her. The room spun. Her breath came faster. She wanted to scream, to get up, to fight. But her body felt heavy, like it wasn't quite her own anymore, like the blood inside her was no longer hers to command. She pushed herself back against the headboard, eyes wide, a cold sweat creeping down her spine. "Where am I?" Her voice came out cracked, hoarse, a few words, and yet they felt foreign on her tongue. Lucian stepped forward from the group. His expression was unreadable, his movements deliberate, like every step he took was calculated, measured. He looked as dangerous as the night itself, his eyes still dark, still gleaming with that predatory intensity. But now there was something else, something colder, sharper, something that wasn't there before. "You're safe," he said, his voice low like a growl that had been dragged through a storm. "For now." His words made her heart race even faster, but not for the reasons she'd expected. She knew what he was saying wasn't true, not really. "You're not safe," she spat, her chest tightening with the weight of his presence. "None of us are." Her words felt like knives in the air. They didn't faze him. His eyes locked onto hers, steady as steel. "You're bound to us now," he said, voice thick with an unspoken history, "whether you want to be or not." She shook her head, trying to push herself further into the bed, trying to make sense of the mess her life had become. But nothing made sense, not anymore. The others shifted then. Ronan, Cale, Dorian. They watched her in silence, their gazes as cold and calculating as Lucian's, but there was something else, something that flickered behind their eyes. Guilt, maybe, or maybe just resignation, as if they knew exactly what had to be done but didn't want to face it. "Where are we?" she asked again, her voice more forceful this time. "What are you?" Dorian spoke first. His voice was the smoothest of the four, cold and deliberate. "We're not here to hurt you, Seline, not anymore." Ronan snorted under his breath, clearly not believing the words himself. "That's not the problem, sweetheart." Seline's hands curled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as the realization hit her like a sledgehammer. They hadn't just saved her, they'd bound her to them. She could feel it in the air, thick, like chains wrapping around her chest. Lucian's voice broke through the silence, dragging her attention back to him. "The curse." He said it like a weight had fallen on his shoulders, his jaw tightening as the words left his mouth. "It's not something we can undo. It was forged by our ancestors, a debt that ties us together, the bloodline, the bond. It can't be broken, not without the lunar grimoire." He paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes never leaving hers. "But breaking it isn't easy. It's dangerous. It could kill us all." The words echoed in Seline's head, bouncing off the walls like hollow things. A curse, a debt. Her body tingled with the remnants of the bond, her skin humming where Lucian's fangs had been, where his blood had mixed with hers. She could feel it now, running through her like wildfire. Something ancient, something that wanted to consume her. She could feel their presence, each of them, seeping into her thoughts, into her very bones. It wasn't just the pain anymore. It was them, all of them, in her head, in her body. "And the grimoire?" she asked, voice quieter now. "What does it do? What does it take to break this curse?" Lucian stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, his eyes darker than before. "The lunar grimoire can sever the bond, but it will require a sacrifice, one that none of us are willing to make. Not yet." The words hung in the air, thick with implication. She could feel the tension between them, an invisible line that stretched tight, pulling at something deep inside her, a tether she couldn't escape. "There's more," Lucian continued, his voice low and grim. "The bond means you share everything with us now. Our pain, our thoughts, our emotions. What we feel, you'll feel. What we think, you'll know. Whether you want to or not." The weight of those words slammed into her like a freight train. She could already feel it, like a pulse beneath her skin, beating in time with theirs. Her pulse synced with theirs, a dangerous rhythm she couldn't escape. "I didn't ask for this," Seline whispered, more to herself than to them. "We never asked for it either," Dorian said, his voice flat. "But it's the way it is, and now it's the way it's always going to be." The bond was alive now. It had taken root inside her in ways she couldn't understand, couldn't fight. Lucien's words rang through her head like the toll of a bell, deep and final. Breaking it could kill us all. That thought hung over her like a guillotine, but it didn't matter. She knew, deep down, that she was already too far gone. "Then we fight it," Seline said, her voice hardening. "I'll fight it." Lucien's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, but just as quickly the mask of control slipped back into place. "You can't," he said simply. "You can't fight fate." And with that, Seline knew she wasn't in control anymore. Neither of them were. The curse had already won. The cabin felt smaller, suffocating, as Seline paced across the room, her mind a twisted mess of anger, confusion, and something else, something that felt too much like fear. Her skin still burned where Lucien's bite had marked her, and with every heartbeat the bond, the curse, pulled tighter, twisting through her veins like a poisonous vine. She couldn't take it. She had to do something. She couldn't stand here, a prisoner of fate, bound to them by blood and magic she didn't understand. The air around her thickened, the heat building in her chest until it felt like the walls were closing in. Without warning, she lashed out. Her hands surged forward, and with a snap of her fingers, a spark of power shot from her palm. The room flickered with an unholy light, the floor beneath her feet shaking as magic crackled in the air like a thunderstorm waiting to explode. Books flew from shelves, the fire in the hearth flickered and sputtered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. It was too much, too uncontrolled. Ronan's grin was the first thing she saw, that devil-may-care smile that always seemed to be a step ahead of everyone else. He stood at the edge of the room, his arms crossed, watching with casual amusement. "Feisty," he said with a chuckle, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. "I like that." Seline's eyes narrowed, her teeth gritted. "Stay out of this, Ronan." Dorian didn't move. He stood there, a statue, his cold blue eyes scanning her every movement. His lips barely twitched, as if he were watching a far-off storm, indifferent to the destruction it might cause. "Control it," he said, his voice a low rasp devoid of concern or encouragement. "You won't survive it if you don't." Kyle was the one who stepped forward, his presence like a breath of fresh air amidst the tension. His deep brown eyes met hers, steady and calm. His expression was soft, a quiet understanding in the depths of his gaze. Without a word, he raised his hand slowly, as if trying to offer something. Peace, maybe? Or just a moment of calm? Seline's magic crackled, fighting the steady, gentle pulse of Kale's presence, but his aura was enough to keep it from spiraling further out of control. She could feel the magic inside her, wild, untamed, like a beast trapped in a cage. His calmness didn't stop it, but it did slow the storm long enough for her to breathe, long enough for her to think. "Stop," he murmured, his voice deep, soothing. "You don't have to fight it. You don't have to fight us." But she couldn't hear him. Not over the roar of the magic, not over the pounding in her chest that told her she had to fight back. Her hands trembled, the power thrumming in her fingertips, wanting to break free. Then Lucien's voice broke through the chaos, raw and edged with guilt. "Seline," he said, his words softer than they should have been. "You don't understand. This bond, it's not just for us. It's for you too. You're going to need us. We're not your enemies." His words were a damnation, wrapped in the weight of something that felt too much like an apology. He stepped closer, his face drawn, the tension in his jaw speaking of some heavy burden he hadn't shared. He wasn't a hero, not in the way she wanted him to be, but he was here, and he was part of this curse as much as she was. "I don't need anyone," Seline hissed, her chest heaving with every breath, the magic still coiling in her chest like a live wire. "And I sure as hell don't need you!" Lucien stopped in his tracks, the words striking him like a punch. His face tightened, guilt darkening the storm in his eyes. "I never asked for this either, but you're part of us now, whether you like it or not, so stop fighting it." Her hands dropped to her sides, and the power simmered, settling, but only just. The room was quiet now, the tension still thick in the air. The silence stretched between them, and in that moment Seline realized something. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't fight them forever. The weight of Lucien's words settled into her bones, heavy and inescapable. She could fight, she could scream, she could run, but none of it would matter in the end. Her mind raced, but it was clear now. Her survival, and theirs, depended on finding the lunar grimoire. That was the only way out of this cursed bond, the only way to break free from the force that was already claiming her, body and soul. But the grimoire was no easy thing to find. It was buried in some forgotten corner of the world, guarded by more than just time and distance. It was something older, something darker, and the more she thought about it, the more the fear curled around her like a noose. She looked at them, all of them. Ronan's smirk, Dorian's cold indifference, Kael's calmness, and Lucien's guilt-ridden eyes. They were right. There was no other way. She was already tied to them. The bond was alive in her now, pulling her, tightening its grip with every breath she took. If she wanted to survive, she had to take this journey, whether she liked it or not. But that didn't mean she had to trust them. "Fine," Seline said, her voice low, laced with a quiet fury. "I'll go with you. I'll help you find the damn grimoire. But don't think for a second I trust any of you." Lucien didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his face hardened with the weight of her words, but she saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew the price of this journey. He knew the cost. "Just keep your eyes open," Ronan said with a grin, stepping closer. "And your fists ready. We don't have time to play nice." Dorian didn't speak, but his eyes moved between them all, calculating, as always. Kael just gave her a nod, his gentle gaze steady and unwavering. And then Lucien stepped forward, his eyes still locked onto hers. His voice was rough, like he'd been chewing on the words for far too long. "We'll find the grimoire, Seline, one way or another." It wasn't an assurance, it was a promise. And as Seline turned away from them, the pull of the bond still thrumming beneath her skin, she knew. The journey had already begun, whether she was ready for it or not. Chapter 3. Chasing Shadows. The woods had a way of swallowing sound. Every step Seline took felt like it was swallowed by the dark, her boots sinking into the damp earth, the scent of pine thick in the air. The sky was a bruised purple, the moon hanging low like a threat she couldn't escape. The air had that bite to it, the kind that made you feel like you'd been dragged through a storm and left to dry in the open. They'd been walking for hours, the trees pressing in around them, their branches groaning in the wind. Lucien led the way, the edge of his silhouette barely visible through the dark. His movements were smooth, calculated. Each step a reminder that this wasn't some adventure to him. This was his life. A life that he'd been tangled in for far too long. Ronan, on the other hand, was as loose as a wire waiting to snap. His footsteps were louder, more careless, a shadow behind Lucien, with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "You ever wonder why we always end up in the middle of nowhere?" Ronan's grin flashed in the darkness, the gleam of his teeth just barely visible. "I mean, it's like someone up there really wants us to feel lost." The others didn't answer. They never did. And that's the thing about Ronan. He was always talking, always making noise, whether it was to fill the space or distract himself from whatever monster was gnawing at his heels. He was good at it. Kael was the one who stayed silent, his eyes scanning the trees, the shadows, his every step purposeful but calm. He moved like someone who'd spent more time in the woods than most people had spent breathing. His presence was solid, like an anchor. But even Kael couldn't keep the tension from building, not in a place like this. Behind them, Seline trailed, her steps more measured, more deliberate. She was still getting used to it, the pull of the bond that wound between her and them. It was still too much to think about, too much to feel. Every time her thoughts started to settle, the connection would twist, sending a pulse through her veins like an electric shock. Lucian's presence was the most intense, like a low growl at the back of her mind. But it wasn't just him. It was them, all of them. The bond between them was alive, and it was suffocating. Her eyes darted to Lucian as he moved ahead, the subtle tension in his shoulders. He didn't show it, never did, but she could feel it, like he was carrying something heavier than the forest itself. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe that's what had gotten them all into this mess. "You think we're close?" Celine's voice cut through the quiet, the question hanging between them like a cloud. Lucian didn't stop, didn't even look back. He just kept walking, his gaze forward, eyes scanning the dark. "We'll know when we get there." "Helpful," Ronan muttered under his breath, kicking a stone into the woods. "Real helpful." Dorian's voice came next, always precise, always calculating. "We're close, if the maps are correct. But we have to move quickly. The lunar grimoire isn't something that stays hidden by accident." Seline glanced at Dorian. The man was a machine, his movements deliberate, his eyes constantly calculating. She could almost see the wheels turning behind his cold blue stare, working out the next step, the next move, even when nothing had happened yet. Nothing, but the way he was always planning. They walked for hours more, the dark trees twisting above them like silent sentinels. There were ruins ahead, half-forgotten stone walls buried in the undergrowth. The ancient world was still here, half swallowed by time, and yet everything felt like it was still alive. The trees whispered. The ground beneath their feet murmured like something just beneath the surface, waiting to break through. "Nothing's ever easy, ha?" Ronan spoke again, his voice cutting through the stillness like a laugh in the dark. "I thought this whole breaking the curse thing would be a nice stroll, maybe a campfire song or two, some roasted marshmallows." Seline could almost hear the grin in his voice, but there was a weight to it now, a shadow just beneath the sarcasm. Even Ronan wasn't immune to the pressure building in the air. But it didn't change anything. Not yet. Kael slowed his pace, his gaze flicking between the trees. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. But there was something in the way he moved, the way his eyes caught every flicker in the night, that made Seline pause. "We're not alone," Kael said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. The words were a warning, and they all froze. It was subtle, but the shift in the air was enough for Seline to feel it. She turned, eyes searching the trees, but there was nothing, just the thick brush and the shifting shadows, nothing yet. Lucian's body tensed, the energy around him snapping to attention. He stopped in his tracks, his hand moving instinctively to the weapon at his side. Ronan's grin was gone, replaced by a sharp edge in his eyes. "Guess it's not all peaceful out here." Celine's breath caught in her throat, her body ready to spring into action, but she didn't move, not yet. The tension in the air thickened like smoke. Something was out there, watching them. The pull of the bond between them surged again, harder, stronger, and she could feel the others. They were more than just physical bodies. The connection between them now ran deeper. She could sense the power that surged within them, waiting to be unleashed. Lucian spoke first, his voice a low growl. "Stay close. If we're being followed, it won't be long before they make a move." And just like that, the journey continued. Deeper into the dark, deeper into the unknown. The pull of the bond thrummed louder like a warning bell, and Seline couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just walking toward the grimoire. They were walking into something much darker, something none of them were prepared for. She didn't trust them, not yet. But the path had been set, and for better or worse, she was following it. The woods were as silent as a grave, the only sounds the soft crunch of boots on the damp earth and the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by the wind. Selene's feet moved automatically, but her mind was elsewhere, tethered to something much larger than this dark, endless forest. There was no escaping it. The bond had deepened. It was like a shadow, constantly at the edges of her awareness, them, all four of them. It was no longer just the occasional brush of Lucian's presence in her thoughts, no longer the distant echoes of Ronan's laughter. Now their emotions, their thoughts, they were bleeding through, uninvited, loud and clear. Lucian's brooding intensity tugged at her in ways she couldn't explain. There were moments when the world seemed to still, where she'd catch a glimpse of him, his eyes sharp, almost predatory, his body tense with the weight of something he was too tired to carry. It pulled at something inside her, something she didn't want to feel. She shouldn't feel it. Not for him, not for any of them. But then there was Ronan, damn him. Ronan was a whole different kind of weight. His charm was effortless, a smile that could melt a heart and make it ache. He moved like a man who had nothing to lose, and that made him dangerous. His voice, that easy laugh, carried with it a promise of something wild, something untamed. And when he turned those golden eyes on her, when his grin flashed in her direction, it felt like he had just seen her, really seen her, in a way that made the whole damn world disappear for a second. But it was Dorian with his cool, calculating mind. His presence was always there, subtle but steady, like a shadow that refused to leave. His intellect was sharper than any blade, always thinking, always 3 steps ahead. The way he assessed everything around him, even her, was unnerving. He wasn't someone who left things to chance. But there was something in those piercing blue eyes of his, something that made her feel like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. And then there was Cale. Cale, the quiet protector, the steady pulse in the madness. His presence was warmth, something she hadn't known she'd missed until she felt it. His silence was an anchor, grounding her when she felt herself slipping. He didn't try to fix her or change her, but every time his gaze met hers, something inside her would still. The weight of everything else lightened, just for a second. The bond was pulling them closer, like gravity, and she couldn't stop it. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she told herself it was a curse, not a blessing, it was undeniable. She could feel their emotions as clearly as her own, each one raw, real, and entwined with hers. It was suffocating, but it was also something else. Something she wasn't ready to face, something that made her question everything. They weren't supposed to be this close. She wasn't supposed to need them, to feel their presence inside her like an extension of her own body. But the bond was a disease, a curse, and it had spread too far, too fast. The problem wasn't the magic, the problem was the feelings, the things she was starting to feel for them. A flicker of motion in front of her broke the tension, and Lucian stopped. He was facing forward, his posture rigid, like a wolf on alert. His gaze shifted to her for a split second, those stormy eyes locking onto hers with a ferocity that made her heart stutter. For a brief moment it felt like the world stood still. Her pulse quickened, her breath caught in her throat. The pull of the bond surged again, stronger this time, a tightening in her chest that left her gasping for air. His lips parted, like he was going to say something important. But the moment passed. He turned back, his face hardening, the weight of responsibility falling over him like a shadow. Ronan, always the opportunist, was the one who broke the silence. "You know, we're not here to bite," he said with that familiar grin, though there was something darker in it now, something that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But we can all feel it, can't we? The pull, the bond. I don't know about you, Seline, but it's hard to ignore." The words hung in the air like smoke. Celine's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Dorian's voice cut through the tension. "Enough," he said, his voice calm, almost detached, as if this conversation didn't affect him at all. "We're wasting time. The more we fight it, the worse it gets." She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she did, she might crack. She might just let herself fall into the web that had been spun around her, a web made of fangs, claws, and a bond she couldn't escape. Kyle didn't speak. He never did, not in moments like this, but Seline could feel his presence behind her, steady and calm. It was almost a relief in a way. His warmth was like the only part of her that was still hers. The others were slipping away, but Kale was different. He didn't need to possess. He didn't need to claim. He just was. The bond was making her weak, but it was also making her stronger. She could feel it now. How they all were starting to come together like pieces of a broken puzzle that had been scattered across the years, and no matter how hard she fought it, no matter how much she wanted to walk away, she couldn't. The magic between them was binding, pulling her in tighter with every passing minute. "I didn't ask for this," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Ronan's grin was gone, replaced by something that almost looked like regret. "None of us did," he said quietly. "But it doesn't matter. Not anymore." It was too late. The bond had already set its claws into her, and she was too far gone to fight it now. Lucian turned to face her then, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were full of something else. Something she couldn't quite place. Something that made her chest tighten with confusion, with something far too close to longing. "You don't have to like it," he said, his voice gruff, edged with something that almost sounded like guilt. "But we're in this together, Seline. There's no way out." And as the words settled in the stillness between them, Seline realized he was right. There was no way out. Not anymore. The forest had been eerily quiet for hours. A kind of tense calm hung over them, thick like the mist creeping through the trees. The bond still thrummed in Celine's veins, pulling at her, her connection to them, this impossible group that had become more than just a nuisance. There was a tension between them all, a current that ran beneath their words, beneath every step they took. It was there in the way Lucian's jaw clenched when he thought no one was looking, in the way Ronan's eyes danced with something dangerous when he caught Celine's gaze, in the cold stillness that wrapped around Dorian and Kale like a veil. Seline could feel it, deep down. This was no longer a journey of survival. This was something else. It was a game now, one that none of them could afford to lose. But she was starting to wonder who the real enemies were. Then it came. The sound of snapping branches, the rustling of leaves. It was a low, familiar growl, one that made her stomach turn and her blood freeze in her veins. Ronan heard it first. His eyes flashed, and in a heartbeat he dropped into a crouch, his senses on high alert. "We're not alone," he said, voice barely above a whisper. His grin was gone now, replaced with the sharp edge of someone who knew exactly what danger smelled like. Dorian was already moving, his movements calculated, methodical. He surveyed the area, eyes scanning the shadows, his hand moving instinctively to the blade at his side. "It's a trap," he murmured. "They're closing in on us." Kale's hand went to the hilt of his own weapon, but his eyes were calm, unhurried. He looked like he had all the time in the world, even as the forest seemed to press in closer, its shadows darkening around them. "Stay together," he said, his voice low, steady. "We'll get through this." Lucian, ever the leader, didn't wait for any further orders. His gaze hardened, his expression set in stone. He knew what was coming, and Seline could feel it in the air too, a sickening feeling in her gut, a warning she couldn't ignore. Then they came, dark figures moving with unnatural speed, darting between the trees like shadows given form. They were creatures twisted, like something out of a nightmare. Cloaked in darkness, their eyes gleaming with malice, the smell of decay clung to them, and the magic in the air turned sour. Seline's pulse spiked, her body tensed, every muscle screaming for action. But the magic she felt inside her, raw, untamed, pushed to the surface like a wave crashing against the shore. It surged through her without warning. She couldn't control it, not now. It was too powerful, too much. She threw her hands out instinctively, releasing a burst of energy. It crackled in the air like a storm, striking the closest creature in a burst of light. The creature screamed as the magic ripped through its form, but it didn't go down. It just staggered back, its body writhing and twisting, as if it was made of something far worse than flesh. "Damn it," Seline hissed, her voice strained. "It's not enough, it's not stable." Her magic was unstable, flickering like a dying flame, but it was powerful, too powerful. Her body burned with the energy, but it was uncontrolled, unpredictable. It was a danger to everyone, including herself, and as she tried to rein it in, another creature leapt at her, claws slashing through the air. But then they moved. Lucian was the first to close the distance, his form shifting, morphing into his wolf state in a blur of fur and muscle. He collided with one of the creatures with the force of a freight train, his claws raking through its body with brutal efficiency. The beast went down, but not without a fight. Lucian's growl echoed through the clearing, low and guttural, a warning to the others. Ronan followed, his movements chaotic but effective. He was everywhere at once, slashing with his blades, knocking creatures aside with wild abandon. His laughter echoed through the chaos, almost manic. "Told you I'd like a good fight," he shouted, his eyes gleaming with that reckless thrill he always wore like a second skin. Dorian was more controlled, his sword flashing in the moonlight as he cut through the creatures with precision, his focus never wavering. Every strike was calculated, every move deliberate. He didn't waste energy. He didn't waste time. He just killed and moved on to the next.